Hey, everybody. Welcome to Moderate Rebels at the Gray Zone. We are live streaming on YouTube and at Rockfin as well. So I'm going to go live there in a second. Here we go at Rockfin at my Foreign Agents channel. You can also check this out. And we have a really important guest today, Stella Moris, the fiancée of political prisoner and journalist and publisher Julian Assange. To address the continued US and UK's political persecution of Julian Assange, who is still held in maximum security confines at the Belmarsh prison and who recently had some very significant hearings. The Biden administration is still seeking the extradition of Julian Assange. Attorney General Merrick Garland will not turn back on this case, even though it has completely fallen apart. And so we're going to address the details of the collapse of this case and the continued sadism of the US and UK establishment against the wishes of pretty much every human rights organization in the world, the UN, and every press freedom organization we can think of. So Stella Moris, welcome to Moderate Rebels. It's great to see you. How are you doing?
Thanks, Max. Well, I'm holding up, I guess.
Under some very difficult circumstances, sure. But I feel a sense of hope here. I don't know if that's overly optimistic. I'm definitely not an optimist, but I feel some hope for Julian's freedom. Am I wrong to feel that way?
Well, I just think that the case, as you said, has fallen apart, and now we just see this. Julian's brother called it as a zombie case. It's in the legal process, so it just trundles along through the courts, but it has no substance to it, and it never did. In fact, the U.S. took an unprecedented move under the Trump administration to use the Espionage Act for the first time against a publisher for publishing true information to the public. And they're doing it under the rubric of the Espionage Act, but he's not actually accused of espionage as we usually understand it. Espionage is when you secretly take government information and channel it to a foreign power in secret to benefit that power. Julian did the opposite. He received information from a journalistic source and he published it to the public. And this was important information that was of historical, legal, political importance, and that had an extraordinary impact. And for that, Julian was awarded the highest prizes journalism has globally. He won the Australian equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize, the Walkley Award, and he won the various journalism awards here in the UK and internationally as well, and the Sydney Peace Prize, because there was a recognition that Julian's publications about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had significantly impacted the course of those wars.
We got Ben Norton in the house. Ben is in Nicaragua and has been very busy as elections are approaching there. So he was a little late. He had, I think, a better excuse than I did the last time I was late because I was locked out of my house and had to break in. But Ben's here with us, and welcome, Ben.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. And just to continue that thread, Stella, I'm wondering if you could talk about the most recent hearing, which was October 27th. There was a 2-day hearing, and the U.S. lawyer's argument was essentially that, or rather the representative for the U.S., the lawyer representing the U.S., the argument was essentially that Julian Assange should be extradited because the expert testimony was not legitimate, because the expert testimony, which talked about the very real threats to Julian's mental health and the very real possibility of suicide or death in the U.S. prison system, essentially the attorney representing the U.S. was trying to discredit that expert witness by saying that the expert witness is unreliable because the expert didn't mention you. So I'm wondering if you could respond to the most recent hearing and the arguments of the representatives of the U.S.
Well, there are different aspects to this. Firstly, to say it's completely absurd that we're even sitting and talking about these issues, because basically the UK courts seem very comfortable when they're talking about everything but the political aspect of the case. When we were going through the long extradition hearing at the lowest court last year, the US was trying to exclude evidence from, for example, Khalid al-Masri, who was one of the rendition victims that was able to use WikiLeaks publications in his court cases in order to win at the European Court of Human Rights. And they were desperate to exclude that evidence from being aired in court, precisely because it was so embarrassing to the United States. And in fact, I think before Majid Khan aired his testimony about CIA torture in, I think, a New York court last week, or at least it was reported last week, I saw. I think Khalid al-Masri's evidence in Julian's extradition hearing last year was the first time that a torture rendition victim was able to confront the United States with his torture, because the U.S. has been able to exclude that forum in every other instance, and so this was hugely significant. And al-Masri wanted to be able to speak about his torture, and to be able to speak about how significant the WikiLeaks publications that Julian is being prosecuted over were, for him to be able to achieve justice. So really, like, we should never lose perspective of what this case is really about. But it is true that the UK and the US have a highly restrictive extradition treaty, which restricts the UK's ability to bar extradition under very limited grounds. And one of those grounds is what they call oppression. And that is what they have found to be the reason to block this extradition, because an extradition would be oppressive. And the lowest court judge found that if Julian were to be extradited, that would lead to his death. She was convinced, after hearing expert testimony from numerous experts to that effect, that they had assessed Julian over a period of time, and there was no doubt in their mind. And there are several aspects that play into that. It's not about Julian saying, "Oh, I'll commit suicide." It is about Julian's state of health that has been deteriorating steadily while he was in the embassy. Towards the end of being in the embassy, it was a horrendous atmosphere that was deliberately trying to suffer him out of the embassy, so they wouldn't have to do what they ended up doing, which is expelling him, because that came at a political cost for Ecuador. And then once he was in Belmarsh High Security Prison, obviously his health has deteriorated at a much faster rate, especially during the periods that he's been in isolation. And so there's a very detailed, documented record of his deterioration. And another aspect is that he's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and that means that the risk of suicide, I think, is 8 times higher. And thirdly, the overwhelmingly likely conditions, certain conditions, as far as the experts during the extradition case gave their testimony. And also the US government admits that Julian would be placed in isolation in conditions of basically solitary confinement, because that's what the US does, especially in national security cases. And so that was the finding of the lowest court. And that was what the US government was appealing to the High Court, which is the second level court in the UK. And so it was very limited scope for the hearing. But during this time, there have been some new reports, and they were able to be introduced into the proceedings as well. We don't know when the judgment will come down. We think it's a matter of weeks rather than months, but that's just guesswork.
Am I correct that I don't know if it was the judge or the prosecution. I think it was the prosecution referring to some kind of solitary recreation that could be promised Julian if he were extradited to a supermax prison. That they,
Yeah, I mean, they were. It felt like they were being facetious when they were talking about how Julian would be perfectly fine in his cell for 22 hours a day or 23 hours a day, and then have recreation in a separate cell. He would be able to communicate, they said, with other prisoners through the pipes, and he could crochet in his cell. It's like they were making a big joke out of all of this, and I really experienced it as such a violation and an abuse. It's just a further dehumanization, and they've taken Julian's suffering. When you take when you look at what they did with Ellsberg, the plumbers tried to steal his psychiatrist's notes in order to use his private life and mental health against him. But through the process, and that's what made his case collapse. But if you look at what the US has done here, it's basically done the same, but aired it in court, and is now trying to undermine it. This suffering that the US government has inflicted over so many years, they're now taking that and turning it upside down, laughing at his suffering, laughing at his likely suicide. We were sitting there for 2 days talking about whether he could be committing suicide or not, and it was just it's hard to describe. It's so cruel. The whole process is just so cruel. And Julian sat there for a few hours on the first day. He had asked to come to court, but the court had refused his physical presence. And then he was over video link on a higher medication, and just couldn't follow. And after I don't know how long, maybe an hour and a half, he just wasn't. He was actually in the video room because Belmarsh prison didn't get the memo that the judges didn't require him to be there. He wanted to leave, but the Belmarsh didn't let him leave the video room, so he was just sitting there, not being able to follow anything, just trying to prop himself, his head up, because he couldn't follow anything. He couldn't stay alert or take anything in. And what he was hearing was this absurd exposition by the US, discussing his isolation in a US prison, and that he would live through this torture, basically describing the torturous conditions that he would live in, and discussing his suicide.
And so just to reinforce this insane episode, or to just clarify, the prosecutor, this is James Lewis, was detailing the torturous conditions that Julian would be held in a supermax prison as something that should be welcomed by the judge as humane conditions, because he would be able to communicate with other prisoners through pipes and crochet, would do 23 hours a day in solitary with 1 hour of some kind of confined recreation. It almost sounds like they're taunting Julian and his family. This sounds completely sadistic. Were they taunting, or what? Are they so delusional and so sociopathic that they actually thought that this was a good case for his extradition? I mean, I'm just stunned at what you just described. It's just shocking to me, the mentality of the prosecutors.
It is shocking, and it did feel like they were taunting. And when they brought up crochet, it's hard to interpret it as anything other than that. But I just see this as they're mercenaries, and to a degree, I think the people who are driving this in the DOJ are also just mercenaries. They're trying to advance their career. They're not thinking of the bigger political consequences. It's a big case, and they don't really hold themselves responsible for what happens to Julian.
They're just following orders, as we say.
That's right.
Which, I mean, as the Nuremberg trials established, is not actually a legitimate argument.
Right. Well, hopefully they'll be on trial in some alternate universe. Ben, I don't know if you have a question.
Yeah, Stella, there have been media reports in the past several days of you saying that you have been afraid that the CIA might actually hurt you in some way, or potentially something even worse. We've known for the past 2 years, but we have mainstream media acknowledgement from Yahoo News, from a journalist who's very close to U.S. intelligence agencies, admitting that the CIA discussed potentially killing Julian Assange when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, where the United Nations working group established that he was being arbitrarily detained. And we know that the CIA also discussed poisoning him, kidnapping him. You have also said that you have feared that you and your family, your 2 children you have with Assange, could also be targets. I don't want to try to open any wounds, but just I think it's important to talk about the other people, not just Assange, but people around Assange who are potentially being threatened just for speaking out on this important case. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. What we've seen is really extraordinary. So just to go back a bit, Julian was arrested on the 11th of April, 2019, and he's been in Belmarsh prison ever since. And after he was arrested, something important and interesting happened and started, I think, started a snowball, which is that several whistleblowers then came forward. These whistleblowers were working in the security company that was providing, well, ostensibly providing security to the embassy where Julian was for 7 years, in the Ecuadorian embassy. And they went to the Spanish press. They went initially, and then they went to Spanish police and provided a trove of data. And over the following months, an investigating judge, a senior investigating judge in Madrid, opened an investigation, and that investigation has been going now for over 2 years. There are 2 people indicted and charged. One is the CEO of that security firm, and the other one is the chief of operations. And through that investigation, we learned, and also through these whistleblowers and all the data they provided, that Julian was being targeted, and the people around him, specifically his lawyers and me and our 6-month-old baby and my mother, we were being targeted by name. We were being followed. Julian's lawyers were being also targeted by name. They had documents stolen, photographed, and so on. This was extraordinary. It's not just a case of an embassy having a closed circuit video television installed. This was audio recordings, microphones under fire extinguishers, hidden microphones being shipped off to the United States. And Max wrote an excellent summary or excellent piece about this investigation. So what we had as soon as Julian went into the embassy was the implementation of these highly sophisticated targeted operation. And the people who were carrying out this operation were saying that they were working for the CIA. But we didn't have any proof, any, at that point, link from the information that they had initially brought to the Spanish court. The link to the CIA was missing. But now, just recently, there was this story in Yahoo News, and it has the other side, the planning side to it. And so we had information about how they were discussing within the security company how to poison Julian and how to deniably allow him to be kidnapped from the embassy by leaving the door open and him just disappearing. We had that since 2019, and now you have this other element that the US was planning, was sketching. The CIA had, under Mike Pompeo, had tasked the agency to produce what they called sketches and options about how to assassinate Julian. This was in 2017 and 2018. And so the timeline matches exactly with the company that was working in the embassy, with Mike Pompeo's tenure as CIA director. So it's an extraordinary thing. You usually would never expect to hear or find out about the plots that were being planned against a CIA target. But here we have both the kind of implementing side and the planning side. And this is because whistleblowers, sources who are deeply uncomfortable with what was going on, have started to come out. And I think this is just the beginning.
Yeah, and we saw some of the staffers from UC Global, the firm, the Spanish security firm that was being obviously now used by the CIA to target Julian, everyone around him, as they pretended to run security for the Ecuadorian embassy on behalf of Ecuador's security services. They came out in the Spanish National Court and basically said that there were discussions of assassinating Julian Assange. That was what I reported based on testimony and internal communications from UC Global back in May of last year. So that's what Isikoff and his team at Yahoo News essentially confirmed with comments from CIA officers, both current and former, that Pompeo now wants to prosecute. And there's two dimensions. I mean, we should talk about the language Pompeo used about WikiLeaks, but first there's something I've wanted to ask you, which is that the one staffer described confronting you, if I'm correct, on a street and informing you that he was told to steal your son's diaper out of a trash can in order to determine if it was yours and Julian's son through the DNA, which is weird on so many levels. It suggests they had Julian's DNA because there was no discussion of getting his DNA. And you can't get DNA from feces. So anyway, he had basically had enough of all these orders he was getting, and he confronted you on a street and basically disclosed to you that there was a plot, an intelligence plot. Is that correct? And if so, I mean, what was that like? What was the next course of action for you?
Well, I had been bringing Gabriel in for the first 6 months of his life, and that's our eldest son. And the way for Julian to be able to see our son was that I asked a friend of mine to come in and pretend that it was his. And he was coming in to give Chinese lessons. Obviously, the UC Global staff were suspicious and tried repeatedly to get his Gabriel's, passports and so on. And we just said he doesn't have one because he's just a few months old, and why would you want that, right? So then they took it to the next level and tried to harvest his DNA. The security staff guy came up to me when I had left the embassy one day to buy lunch, and took me to one side and said, we're being asked to do some very strange things. Be careful, and you shouldn't bring that baby in. And I just said, what baby, kind of thing. and he was like, no, seriously, it's not safe. We've been asked to steal a diaper to get the DNA, and you shouldn't bring him in anymore. And at that point, this was December 2017. At that point, I realized, well, I always knew that the situation was precarious, but at that point, I realized that things were very creepy and sinister. And it just, mind you, this was a whole year and 4 months before Julian was expelled. So you can just imagine, like, this just escalated over time. From I'd say December was really tense to December 2017. But it just kind of got really vicious inside that embassy. And I didn't bring Gabriel in after that point. And it's terrible, Julian wasn't able to see his son because of this insane situation that we found ourselves in until Belmarsh.
Yeah, and so it was a sort of psychological terror in addition to all the surveillance in order to isolate him. And then there was the revelation by a former business associate of UC Global of David Morales, who's sort of on trial in Spain, except the US DOJ refuses to cooperate, so nothing can go forward. But this person said Morales proposed an assassination. Obviously, he was getting those orders from elsewhere, but that would seem to. No one. I reported that, okay, and I reported it at the Gray Zone. On Wikipedia, we're considered a deprecated source because a bunch of neocons who Jimmy Wales has installed as editors or blessed as editors have decided, because we report too many inconvenient facts. So the Gray Zone, it wasn't enough for us to report that. It required a mainstream media organization to come forward and confirm all of this, which was just using like primary sources, testimonies, internal communications. It wasn't really conjecture. But now that it's just so confirmed, it has really become part of the case. It has worked its way into the hearings. And I just wanted to ask you about a very unusual comment by the judge. If I'm getting this right, the judge said, well, obviously the CIA has an interest in Julian Assange. It was much more than an interest there. But
he said something like intense interest.
Yeah, how is the judge, in your view, reacting to the confirmation of this assassination plot? Is this an attempt to sort of downplay and dismiss what was taken? There are several judges, but how do you receive this kind of language or interpret it?
I don't think I can really state my opinion.
Understandable. Maybe I phrased the question wrong.
No, but Julian's barrister was very strong. He's a kind of the advocate in court who actually presents the arguments, Mark Summers. and he quickly responded saying, this isn't about an intense interest. This is about the CIA's plans to seriously harm Julian. And then he was able to talk about specifically what those serious ways to harm Julian entailed. And sorry. And the judge didn't stop him from detailing those things. So I think it was important. And, you know, the British courts are very uncomfortable when things are political in a case. And this is a political case, and they are deeply uncomfortable whenever we're talking about the political aspects of this case. And if we lose, if the US wins this appeal, then all the political aspects of this case will be back center stage in the courtroom. So,
yeah. And the prosecutor, for those who don't know, is a barrister named James Lewis, who he's like the establishment's man. He defended the British soldier who killed John Pat Cunningham during the Troubles in Ireland. Basically, clear case of a soldier shooting someone in the back, and he was brought in. He was also, I think, involved in some prosecutions around the Falklands War. So it really does seem to be that the British establishment has cohered around this case, while they are increasingly isolated and the case has fallen apart. I mean, I don't know what kind of argument they can make about the U.S. receiving Julian and providing him a free and fair trial when his attorneys were spied on by UC Global CIA assets, when there was a discussion of assassinating him by the very government that's seeking him. And given the state of the US prison system, where people in supermax prisons are tortured on a daily basis, as well as his mental state. But there's also the issue of Siggy Thordarson, who is the main witness in the Espionage Act indictment, who is admitted that he lied and was lying to get out of a sex offense case. To what extent was this this component of the collapse of Julian's prosecution a factor in the hearings?
well, it wasn't dealt with at this stage of the appeal because the basically the CIA story was able to be introduced because of the CIA's role in determining Julian's conditions once he's extradited. The Sigurdur Thordarson revelation hasn't been able to be aired in court because it wasn't part of the appeal point, which was oppression, specifically in relation to Julian's mental health. If we lose this appeal, then that is a very important new component that directly impacts the case in general. I mean, the Thordarson, just to go back a bit, the Yahoo story is interesting because it sets out a timeline. It sets out a timeline that Pompeo came in, was looking at ways to kill Julian, looking at ways to kidnap Julian from the embassy and rendition him. And then there were some components of the US government, of the US executive, that saw that this was a completely illegal and insane thing that Pompeo was planning. And then, so there was disagreement within the US government. And I think it's really important when we talk about the US government, we talk about the UK establishment, and so on. We have to remember that there are actually different factions, there's disagreements, and that's important that there are these disagreements. We're not dealing with a homogenous mass, because it means that Julian's case can be dropped if the right factions are empowered enough, if they're getting the right signals from the electorate, from the public, from the media, and so on. So it's important to always keep in mind that there are different factions. And but what happened then? So these factions then pressured the DOJ to issue an indictment. And obviously that's not supposed to happen. There's supposed to be a separation of powers. And I think that the US is quite unusual in that it has a highly politicized Department of Justice. I mean, just the FBI's relationship with the DOJ and the CIA's relationship with the DOJ. It's just, it's a lot more, it's a lot closer than other systems. And I mean, for example, Bill Barr, Bill Barr used to be a CIA officer, actually. Then he became a CIA lawyer and defended the CIA before the Church Commission and sorry, I forget the other one. And then
Iran-Contra, he helped basically get all the Iran-Contra felons off. He wrote their pardons.
Right.
After fighting as a young man, fighting attempts to reform the CIA following the revelations of the Phoenix program, assassination program in Vietnam, and so many other scandals. So yeah, that's a great point. The DOJ is really part of the national security state in the US.
Yeah. And Bill Barr is the Attorney General who brought the the first superseding indictment against Julian, which escalated from one 5-year charge, one charge that carried a 5-year sentence to 18 charges, 17 of them under the Espionage Act, for publishing true information to the public. And so, this Barr is still a creature of the CIA. He's still on the advisory board of, sorry, I can't remember exactly, but he's still formally associated to the CIA. And so what this indictment that we see is a construct that is born out of what the CIA was trying to do to Julian. It is unprecedented and dangerous because of the press freedom precedent, the attack on press freedom, the precedent it sets that can be used against anyone if the government so chooses. And that's the first time that they've gotten away with this. And if they do get away with it, they can deploy it again and again and again. And it's not just against Julian. They've been trying to do this for years and years. You'll remember that James Rosen was described as a co-conspirator with his source at the State Department, an unindicted co-conspirator, which means they could have just indicted him. So they've been experimenting with this possibility of prosecuting journalists for doing their job for years and years. And the CIA story also went into some detail about how the US government under Obama was looking to designate Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald as information brokers, essentially the same thing as what Pompeo later did with this designation, non-state hostile intelligence service. And what that did was basically create an internal term that allowed the CIA to make these plans and carry out operations without congressional oversight and without presidential sign-off. It's just like this secret society, these internal rules that the CIA has developed in order to be completely unaccountable and get away with murder, literally. But I just want to go into this non-state hostile intelligence service just for a minute.
Please do.
Let's break it down, right? Non-state, what does that actually mean? It means, well, independent.
Independent media.
Right. Hostile. Well, hostile to what? Hostile to US interests? I mean, you know, the world is not the United States. There are different countries with different interests, but we're not even talking about a state entity. We're talking about a journalistic entity that is critical, basically. Hostile equals critical. So we've got independent critical intelligence service, aka journalistic outfit, right? They just basically securitized an independent critical journalistic outfit and turned these terms into national security threats. That kind of took it to an extreme.
Yeah,
but
just using language to create political space for assassination
with legal implications. This is very similar to what they did with enhanced interrogation techniques, right? You don't call it torture. That means a whole different set of rules apply. This is the same idea. But apart from that, I mean, I just find it incredible that the cognitive dissonance between having Pompeo announcing non-state hostile intelligence agency. This is the CIA, right? The CIA does lots of things. It tortures, it murders, and so on. But it's also an intelligence agency. So their role is to actually find out whether, you know, who's a spy, who isn't. And so by April 2017, when Pompeo made this speech, he revealed to the world that the CIA's conclusion when it came to WikiLeaks was that they weren't Russian agents. It's in the title, non-state hostile intelligence service, right? At the same time, the CIA was planting, and it's in that CIA story, propaganda, planting stories, feeding the Russiagate narrative because it suited their purposes. Their purposes were to attack WikiLeaks, to imprison Julian or kill him, to weaken the organization, to weaken, to impede its ability to publish, as in retaliation, as revenge over Vault 7, which was published under the Trump presidency, one of the first publications that WikiLeaks published once Trump got in. And so the CIA was basically weaponized Russiagate and fed this narrative they knew was false. Like, if anyone in the US was in charge of knowing whether WikiLeaks and Julian were Russian agents or whatever, it's the CIA. And they concluded that he wasn't and that WikiLeaks wasn't. And then they announced it, but they still fed this narrative and created complete political chaos and social chaos in the United States for years. And we still see that, and just fed this market that opened up about this enormous conspiracy theory that was completely baseless.
Can I interrupt really quickly? Because you referred to the CIA feeding stories. Let me just, I mean, I can't believe this story is still up there. It still exists. But I mean, was this one of the stories by Luke Harding? The Manafort held secret talks with Assange in Ecuadorian embassy. Sources say this story's been proven to be false. Manafort denied it. There's no record that anyone has of them being there. WikiLeaks denied it, but it's still up, and it's coming from Ecuadorian sources that come very close to being U.S. intelligence assets. I mean, I don't want to get into any details. Was this one of the stories, or which stories are you referring to?
I mean, this is the most famous one, but there were, huge amounts of almost on a daily basis, and they were retracted. And then the next one came out, and then it had to be, countered and then retracted. And who could keep up? Only only WikiLeaks and about maybe 100 people were actually keeping up, keeping the record straight, because it was just a strategy of attack, and then the public doesn't have time or the resources, or they have lives to live, and can't keep up with what was an enormous strategy to discredit Julian, to try to place an enormous question mark over his motives and his associations and so on. But in fact, the CIA revealed what it had concluded and announced it: non-state hostile intelligence service, i.e., independent media organization that is critical of U.S. policy at times when the information, when
it makes a serious impact.
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
you could define the gray zone the same way. I guess we just haven't made enough of an impact. We got to try harder.
Well, yeah. And Stella, there's a few points I want to respond to, especially on this topic of how the specificity of language is very important and how we can sometimes look over these terms. But really quickly, I just wanted to say, well, Max is on the point, not to belabor this point, but I'll say that a top level former Ecuadorian government official told me that he thinks it's very likely that Manafort story came from SENAIN, which is the Ecuadorian intelligence services that were working with the CIA to spy on Assange, and that SENAIN was the linking point between the UC Global firm that the CIA was spying on, which was writing these reports using SENAIN's intelligence, which was in fact CIA intelligence. But a lot of it was also just bogus intelligence that SENAIN was feeding to the Moreno government, the Lenin Moreno government, because they just wanted to tell Moreno what he wanted to hear, which is what the US wanted to hear. And I just want to point out that Moreno was so disgraced by the SENAIN intelligence agency that he actually disbanded it because it was just proven to be so farcical, so fraudulent, and everything they did was either completely false or was just taken from the CIA, that he was forced to dissolve it. But anyway, a point that I wanted to emphasize, you mentioned how when Pompeo gave that speech, which it was at a think tank, actually, which is interesting. It shows the revolving doors between DC think tanks and the US government itself. But when Pompeo gave that speech referring to WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence agency, a lot of people didn't think twice necessarily about what he said, not realizing the legal precedent that he set. Well, another term that we know that the CIA was using in a similar way, another euphemism that they have been using to try to reclassify journalists, is information broker. We know that because of the Yahoo News investigation, that the CIA referred to journalists and WikiLeaks supporters and WikiLeaks employees as, quote, information brokers, to try to take away the label journalist so they can relabel them something that they themselves termed, so they can then criminalize being an information broker. And we saw in that Yahoo News story, again, I mean, Max reported this over a year and a half ago, so a lot of what we know from the story isn't necessarily new, but something that they acknowledged in this Yahoo News story is, I'm just going to read this passage here, that agency executives, that's of course CIA executives, quote, requested and received sketches of plans for killing Assange and other Europe-based WikiLeaks members who had access to Vault 7 materials, said a former intelligence official. So the important point there is that the CIA is relabeling journalists information brokers and admitting that they received sketches of plans for killing not just Assange, but, quote, Europe-based WikiLeaks members. I mean, this seems to be not only is the case against Assange in an incredible brave new world in terms of trying to prosecute journalists, but renaming journalists information brokers and making plans to kill them. Oh, admittedly, I mean, that's something well beyond violating freedom of the press and freedom of speech. That's violating freedom to live. I don't know if you can comment on this, but this seems so Orwellian.
I think part of the problem is that we're dealing with incredibly powerful organizations that have incredibly powerful tools. It's not just the CIA. I mean, what does that even mean, information broker, in the era of information? Think about what social media organizations are doing. I mean, I think there's a very good case to be made that they are information brokers, right? They can censor. They're completely unaccountable. We don't know when we're shadow banned, etc. They can direct information to people's accounts and suppress information. And we are under the illusion that it is some kind of public space, but it's not. It's an intermediated space. And traditional journalism is perceived by the powerful as an incredible threat. And what does that mean? Do we really have the tools to be able to counter these incredibly powerful organizations? I mean, we're talking about press freedom, but it feels like things are well beyond that point. I mean, the US was planning to assassinate a journalist. Saudi did that with Khashoggi in their consulate in Turkey. But the US was doing the same at the same time, planning to do against Julian, because he published information that embarrassed the US government. And I think they're just so far gone, and we're kind of clinging to these old concepts and these old rights that are incredibly weak at this point. Because of what I've experienced personally, maybe I feel it more acutely, but I think everyone is kind of in the same boat right now, and we're in a very dangerous state, and we're descending into a more and more dangerous state. And the protections that we've relied on, we refer to, the Pentagon Papers and so on, but that was 50 years ago, and there's a lot of rights that have been undone over the past 20 years, and we haven't gained any ground. We've just lost ground, and we're losing ground on a more and more accelerated pace. And Julian's case is kind of emblematic of this shift. And whether he wins or loses this kind of charts where we're at, and whether we can regain any ground or not. So this is about Julian, saving Julian's life. And it's about a lot more than that.
Absolutely. There's a great piece out by John Reese today. I'll throw it up on the screen. And I want to read a passage from it and get your response. He calls the Assange appeal the defining trial of our time. And I tend to agree. It's certainly the press freedom trial of the century. And, a lot of NGOs, press freedom NGOs and human rights NGOs, to me, they've been kind of asleep as this persecution developed. But now they're finally starting to speak up because I think they see what's at stake. Outside the courts, Reese writes, That balance of the argument has swung Assange's way. Amnesty International, the American Civil Liberties Union, Human Rights Watch, and practically every human rights organization on the planet is calling for the end to this extradition. So is the National Union of Journalists, its Australian equivalent. Assange is an Australian citizen who's been, in my view, betrayed by his government, and the International Federation of Journalists. So are parliamentarians across the globe. So is the UN. By the way, not parliamentarians here. Haven't heard much from the squad. So is the UN. So are many of the major newspapers in the UK, even those who have been hostile in the past. Only the core of the political establishment remains obdurate. The Tory cabinet, the Labour leadership, the BBC, entranced as ever by the special relationship with the US. To what extent can this development affect the outcome of Julian's prosecution?
You mean all the major?
The fact that these groups are finally speaking up. I mean,
I think it has a huge impact, and these organizations, some are braver than others, and they really depend on who is in charge. And there are staff changes, so sometimes there's movement all of a sudden in an organization that has been dormant for a long time. And they're also constrained, let's be real, by their funding sources. But there is kind of they're also, they're looking at what their peers are doing. And they're also sensitive to criticism over not being active on a certain case. So to the viewers, I urge them, if you're part of an organization and it hasn't taken a stance, the easiest way to get them to do something is to roll out the list of the ACLU and Amnesty and so on, and saying, why are you the outliers? Why should I be supporting you?
Cough, index on censorship.
Why aren't you on that list? And why should I be bringing my money to you and not to them? So they're very sensitive to this kind of thing, especially when the big players are very strong. Amnesty has been very strong. They still haven't designated him a prisoner of conscience. I hope that's just a matter of time. Reporters Without
He needs
Borders,
to be Russian, maybe.
It's very interesting to see, speculate what kind of constraints internally there might be when something's so obvious. Similarly to the Nobel Peace Prize, there's a lot of criticism actually in Norway. All the major mainstream papers are carrying opinion pieces and articles about how Julian should have been, at the very least, the third recipient. And that's been ever since the Nobel Peace Prize was announced. There has been a steady publication of articles making that point. So I think it's at this stage, it's just it's carrying itself. This case, there are enough people who are now understand the case or sufficiently informed about the case.
Here's the Nobel Prize winner. Sorry to interrupt. Anyway, you were saying.
That I think there's a critical mass, basically, of civil society organizations, the big players, that are squarely on Julian's side, that have denounced this prosecution. And so the US and the UK and Australia, they're on the back foot. And they just yesterday, I think, issued a statement, Media Freedom, whatever coalition, about the persecution of journalists and so on. And I think it's because they're scared. They set up this whole Media Freedom initiative to coincide with Julian's arrest from the embassy, I think because they understood that they would be under attack for what they were doing to Julian, for imprisoning him, for prosecuting him. And so they set up this Media Freedom initiative, invite a lot of organizations every year to talk about media freedom, and they issue statements just after Julian's hearings. But I see this as a sign of weakness because they know that they don't control the narrative. Because you can issue press releases, but when you have court hearings airing the extraordinary abuse of process, the attack on press freedom, the attack on the public's right to know, the punishment of Julian for exposing war crimes and human rights abuses and torture and rendition, you cannot counter that with some press releases. They're attacking much more fundamental principles and values that go to the core of what people who want to live in a free and fair society value. And so it might have worked for a few weeks in the beginning, but at this stage, Julian's persecution is so clear for everyone to see. He's been in a high security prison for 2.5 years. He's not convicted of anything. And the US is trying to put him in prison for the rest of his life for some of the most important publications in journalistic history that everyone agrees were hugely impactful, that changed the course of history, that allowed for accountability, for court cases to be taken, for victims to receive restitution, and so on. I mean, the scale of the impact of the 2010 Chelsea Manning publications is just enormous, and everyone acknowledges that, and that's what they're going after him for. So you can't the case is just too big, and it's too interwoven with history to try to suppress it with some press releases. It's just deflection, and it's not working.
Thanks for staying with us for so long, Stella. I have one or two questions, if that's all right, and I'm sure Ben might have one. I wanted to ask about the Russia issue that you brought up. It was inserted into the chronicle of events detailed by Isikoff and his sources, his CIA sources, and they invoked this scenario of a shootout with Russian agents transporting Assange to escape at the airport. I don't know how much credibility there is to that, but there's also the story that we've been hearing ever since the Russiagate saga, that Russia was the source of the DNC emails and so on. And we learned that allegedly Trump sent representatives, Dana Rohrabacher, to offer Julian a pardon if he would give up his source and prove that there was no Russia tie. And he refused because he doesn't give up sources like all good journalists. Why would he not trade his source for his freedom and just prove once and for all that Russia was not the source and that he wasn't colluding with Russia, which would have taken off the table this entire narrative?
Well, Julian is very principled, and he would never give up a source, even if it was to gain freedom. Supposedly, he's not that kind of person. The whole Russiagate thing is, it's never had legs to stand on. The Mueller report, the part that pertained to WikiLeaks, was unredacted quietly, I think the day before the 2020 election, to say that there was no evidence to bring any case because they weren't able to, because there was no knowledge, or they couldn't show anything. They couldn't even show that this Guccifer 2 figure was the source of WikiLeaks publications. There is basically just conjecture, and they were able to spin that conjecture for years and years until they had to produce reports and then say, well, actually, we didn't come up with anything, but anyway. But I mean, I think the important thing to well, there are several takeaways from this, which is that you can create a whole market to basically play on people's fears and political allegiances, and take them further and further away from reality, and that's really quite frightening. The second point is that, regardless of who WikiLeaks source was, and Julian has said it wasn't Russia, there were dozens of U.S. outlets, The Hill and The Intercept and many others, who were in fact sourcing from Guccifer 2. And, that is normal. And if, that's that. The U.S. was singling WikiLeaks out and playing on this conjecture that Lucifer 2 was WikiLeaks' source. But I mean, the response to that is, what if? So what? Because it was the source for The Intercept, it was the source for The Hill, it was the source for dozens of other U.S. organizations that were directly communicating with Guccifer 2. And, the New York Times said that if they had received the DNC material, they would have published it, and so on. So it's really just playing on people's fears and frustrations for the people who were voting for Hillary Clinton, and kind of deepening that divide and allowing this false narrative to fester, basically, and to create a huge division and confrontation within the United States. And I think there's a lot of responsibility on these journalists who are basically unaccountable. They write books. They wrote books that have been disproved, but they sold a lot of copies, and the public has been misled, and it's criminal, frankly. I mean, not criminal because I'm not suggesting they should be criminalized, but it's deeply, deeply unethical, and has real consequences in the social fabric of the United States.
Ben, I don't know if there's anything you want to ask in closing.
Well, no, I just want to underscore how important this case is. I, as a journalist, feel so strongly that everyone should be speaking out for Julian Assange. And it's become so clear that this case is so ridiculous on so many levels, from the CIA spying and threats against him, from the fact that the U.S. government's chief source for these accusations against Assange, the source was totally discredited, admitted that he made things up, and is also a pedophile. I mean, there's just so many levels of disgrace to this case, and I really want to thank Stella for coming on and giving us an hour of your time to talk about it. And I know, Max, you said you had another question, so maybe you can wrap up the interview here.
Well, just in closing, I mean, how is Julian doing, and what kind of interactions have you had?
Well, it's very difficult. It's very hard for him because there's no end in sight, and he's in this horrible place, and he's far from home. But we're able to see him regularly, and so we have regular contact, and when he sees the kids, he's able to hold them, and they sit on his lap, and he's able to read stories to them, and so on. But it's brief, but it's a lifeline. I was meant to see him this morning. I went to Belmarsh, and there was some bureaucratic issue, and they didn't bring him to the meeting room, so I sat there for an hour, hoping he'd be brought down, but he wasn't. So, I mean, these kinds of frustrations are just part of the day-to-day situation.
Well, I mean, clearly you and the whole family are under an enormous amount of pressure, but you've continued to keep us informed and keep the momentum going for Julian's freedom. So you have all our admiration. And thank you so much for spending so much time with us and informing our audience. We have a lot of engagement right now, a lot of people watching. So this was definitely very worthwhile. If there's anything anyone can do or keep their eyes on, maybe you could let our audience know right now before we move on.
Well, you can donate to Julian's defense. The U.S. Actually gets to extradite Julian for free. The UK taxpayer foots that bill, and Julian has to raise money to be able to confront the U.S. Abusive case every step of the way. So that's a very significant contribution that people can make. And I have a follow my Twitter account, Stella Moris with 1 R and then 1 at the end, the numeral 1. And I post, good source, like good information that I recommend people read, and also how to donate. I have a pinned tweet. And there are other ways if people want to do tax deductible donations in the US, that's also possible. Just DM me and we can find a way for that to happen. And then secondly, contact your representatives because they care about their re-election. And if you have a small business, a cafeteria, bar, whatever, shop, try to gather signatures that you can then take to your representatives to show that people care about this case. Inform and engage your networks, your friends, your family. What it takes, that's what it takes to get people to care about this case and to understand that an innocent man is being crucified and that he might die and that all our futures depend on his freedom.
Absolutely. Stella Moris, lawyer, fiancée of Julian Assange, thanks so much for joining Moderate Rebels.
Thank you.
So, free Julian Assange,
that's not all.
defund the CIA.
Yeah.
I think we got more to. We're going to go for a little longer because I feel like we have a few more issues to cover. Ben, you're in the center of a pretty momentous situation. You're one of the few people left who can actually speak about it now on social media from a critical perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Just so people don't know, I want to talk about a horrific censorship campaign we've seen in the past few days. Today is November 4th. On November 7th, Nicaragua has national elections. The U.S. government and European Union have repeatedly attacked the integrity of Nicaragua's elections. I can talk more about that in a bit and why those accusations are bogus or ridiculous, especially considering the U.S. government and European countries backed a brutally violent coup attempt in Nicaragua in 2018, trying to violently overthrow the democratically elected Sandinista government. But getting to what's happening this week, on November 7th, there are elections, and a few days before those elections, all of the major social media outlets, they totally just banned Sandinistas, basically. There was a massive purge of Sandinistas. It began actually with Twitter. Twitter, about 10 days before the election, Twitter started purging prominent Sandinista journalists and influencers and communicators and activists. And then exactly a week before the elections, on the night of Halloween, October 31st, Facebook just purged over 1,000 Sandinistas. I know that because I started getting messages from my friends here in Nicaragua, and they were saying, I think we've been hacked. A lot of them they thought they were being hacked. And I started looking and I was like, this is not a hacking operation. This is a purge that basically all of the major Sandinista media outlets, journalists, and communicators and activists were purged from Facebook and Instagram as well. Of course, Facebook and Instagram are owned by the newly rebranded company Meta, M-E-T-A. And we're going to talk about that later. I know Max has a whole thing he wants to talk about. Meta is this like dystopian, neo-feudal, techno-feudal future that $100 billionaire Jeff Bezos wants for us, or rather $100 billionaire Mark Zuckerberg, but also Jeff Bezos wants for us. So here's the article I published at the Gray Zone. Meet the Nicaraguans, Facebook falsely branded bots and censored. So these are photos of Nicaraguans. I know them all personally, and I talked to over 24 Nicaraguans who I know personally. I have met in flesh and blood. I know who they are. They are very much not bots. They are Sandinista supporters, but that's not a crime unless I guess now Meta is saying it's a crime. So anyway, to keep going on the story. So Facebook purged over 1,000 accounts on Facebook, and Meta also purged numerous accounts on Instagram. And not only of individual accounts, but we're also talking about media outlets, including Barricada. Barricada is the official newspaper of the Sandinista Front. So that's like MSNBC is basically the official media outlet of the DNC, of the Democratic Party. That would be like the equivalent of all of the major social media corporations purging MSNBC's accounts. And then Facebook, in its report, which we'll talk about, this report, totally bogus report, was authored by a former NATO press officer who has no background in actual technology or any of this information science. His name is Ben Nimmo. We'll talk about him in a bit. This bogus report claimed that these outlets, these media outlets and these Sandinista activists needed to be purged because they were a so-called troll farm run by the Nicaraguan government and the Sandinista Front. Now, that is totally bogus, again, because as I showed in these interviews that I did, video interviews, these are real people. I know them personally. I'm telling you, I know who they are. They are not trolls. They are not bots. Second of all, after these Nicaraguans posted video on their Twitter accounts, because at first Meta purged them on Facebook and Instagram. So they went to Twitter and they started posting videos saying, Facebook purged me. I'm not a bot. Facebook published this report saying I'm a bot. I'm not a bot. Here I am. And what was the response of Twitter? Twitter then suspended their accounts. So it's so clear. This was a coordinated social media purge. It actually started on Twitter, and then it really drastically expanded on Facebook and Instagram. And then Twitter deleted the accounts of all of the Nicaraguans trying to prove their own existence. I mean, it was totally insane. And the ultimate irony of
this is the account of Ligia Sevilla, who basically declared that she was a real person on Twitter. And so 5 minutes later, Twitter destroyed her account for doing so, for basically contradicting the US regime's narrative.
Yeah, I mean, and the ultimate irony of this is the US government spent billions of dollars. Here it is very quickly. We should actually just play this video.
Yeah,
if you
go
have
ahead.
your
I don't know if I
Yeah, the audio's up. Okay. Go to the beginning, yeah.
Mi nombre es Ligia Sevilla.
My name is Ligia Sevilla. I'm not a bot. I'm not a troll. And my social media accounts were censored.
¿Acaso Facebook no nos
Maybe
permite
Facebook
ser
doesn't allow us to be Sandinistas. I know this girl. She's a young Sandinista activist. I have met her in person. I know who she is. Like, the idea that she's a bot or a troll is blatantly false. And not only did Facebook claim that, but every major media outlet just totally regurgitated Facebook's false claims. It's fake news. And every major media outlet had a headline saying, Facebook takes down Nicaraguan regime's troll farm, or Ortega's personal troll farm. I mean, total fake news, a blatant lie. And the point I was saying is that the US government spent billions of dollars, or at least millions, many millions of dollars, investigating supposed Russian meddling in the 2016 election. And after years of investigation and all this money spent, there we go. Here's Reuters. Facebook says it removes troll farm from the Nicaraguan government. At least this report, the headline is slightly a little bit more balanced, even though it's still fake. But a lot of media outlets didn't even say fake Facebook says. They said Facebook removes Nicaraguan government troll farm, which is totally false. That's totally false. But anyway, the point I'm trying to get at here is that remember Russiagate. The US government spent all this money, all these years investigating, claiming that Russia meddled in the US election. What was the so-called evidence that it found? The only evidence was Facebook memes, was that supposedly this Russian company allegedly linked to the Kremlin, the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, which, I mean, again, we don't even know if it was actually the Kremlin, but we know that this group, this company in Russia, bought Facebook ads, and over half of those Facebook ads were published after the 2016 election. So only half of them became before the election that were supposedly supposed to rig the election on behalf of Donald Trump. Furthermore, most of those ads were apolitical, and some of those ads, as our colleague Aaron Mate showed, included Jesus Christ, a meme of Jesus consoling young masturbation addicts about why they should beat it for Jesus or whatever. So, like, the US government, with a straight face, the FBI, spent all of this time and all these resources trying to claim that Russia hacked the election on behalf of Donald Trump in a quote, Pearl Harbor style attack. And the only evidence they found was Facebook memes. Meanwhile, here we are a few days before Nicaragua's elections, and Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Yeah. Here's the meme that the U.S. government.
Jesus is comforting a chronic masturbator. This is the reason why Hillary Clinton lost, was that Jesus comforted this guy who he's really ashamed. And this compelled so many people to go out and vote. You know, they were chanting, "Let's go Brandon," left and right after they saw this ad. It was over. But yeah, so it was a huge joke. But I mean, I think you should mention, Ben, that one of the guys who was brought in this gigantic Russiagate grift and got tons of money to go after the so-called Russian bots and Russian troll farms was Ben Nimmo, the same person who's now been brought in by Facebook to take down all these accounts. As you mentioned, he's a former NATO press officer. Before that, he wrote for like a fishing magazine, or he was a travel writer. He has no experience in data. He just basically imperial publicist, and he oversees these operations. He went to work for Graphica, which is funded by the Pentagon's Minerva Institute, the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, which is basically an arm of the CIA. And now, I mean, we can talk all day about him and all of the frauds that he's been behind. But during Russiagate, he was identifying real people as bots too, like the Ukrainian concert pianist Val Lisitsa. She has a pretty big Twitter account. She's Ukrainian, but she's not on the side of the Kiev NATO-backed government. So he identified her as a troll and momentarily had her account removed. This other guy, Ian, who is a pensioner in the UK, had his account removed. And then he came out on Sky News and was like, "I'm a real person." He was interviewed on Sky News and they were asking him, like, "Are you affiliated with Russia?" And he said, "No, the video, we could bring it up. It's incredible." But he did what Ligia Sevilla did. He said, "No, I'm a real person. And I'm just disgusted with the neocons who've taken over our government. And so you think I'm a Russian troll?" It was like the greatest kind of have you no shame moment of Russiagate. But this is what Ben Nimmo is responsible for. And now here he is again, totally shameless. And the whole mainstream media doesn't even acknowledge, that Ben Nimmo himself worked for a troll farm called the Integrity Initiative, a UK military intelligence operation called the Integrity Initiative. He was secretly being paid through a fake think tank called the Institute of Statecraft to help them create these clusters of journalists and foment a new Cold War narrative in the UK to drive up military budgets. I mean, this guy is a straight up neocon operative, a state operative. It's not Facebook acting on its own here. And the political consequences are enormous in Nicaragua. This is part of a US information warfare attack on Nicaragua. And that's where I think you should pick up, Ben, there on what the motives behind this were ahead of the election and what the effect will be on the ground in a country where the US has been attempting regime change for years.
Well, it's very clear. The U.S. backed a violent coup attempt in Nicaragua in 2018, as we've often talked about and reported on. And in that time as well, what happened? There was a massive coordinated social media purge of Sandinistas. In fact, some of the friends I know who had their accounts purged last week, who I've talked to in person, I know, again, these are real people, I know them, that this is the second or third or even fourth time that they've been purged. And of course, in 2018, they were purged during the coup attempt, and they were providing an important perspective showing what was actually happening on the ground, that this was a violent coup attempt in which U.S. government-backed, basically fascists, these far-right extremists were erecting these bloody barricades called tranques, taking over communities, wrestling them away from the government and the state, and running these personal fiefdoms as like these warlords. And then they were just all like doing drugs and getting drunk and brutalizing civilians in the communities. And then they were literally hunting down Sandinista activists and supporters. They had WhatsApp groups and other social media groups spreading around photos of Sandinista activists. I have friends, I know people who had their photos sent around, their addresses doxed, their phone numbers doxed, and they were threatened to be killed. There were Sandinistas who were killed, who were tortured. There were houses burnt down, houses marked. This is like biblical stuff where the fascists would go mark the houses of Sandinistas. And while this was happening, the big social media corporations, which are basically arms of the U.S. government, they did a systematic purge of Sandinistas so they could not expose what was actually happening. So the only information, or disinformation rather, that people would have access to about Nicaragua would be the right-wing opposition backed by the U.S. or the major corporate media outlets. And here you can see this is reporting that Max did on the ground during the coup attempt. The purge was then in 2018 was an attempt to control the narrative, to prevent Nicaraguans from being able to share their own experiences and dispel the lies in the media. And that's exactly what's happening right now.
This is the home of a council member in Messiah. It was completely burned down and trashed by U.S.-backed opposition gangs in 2018. So as Ben's explaining, the purge is an extension of this campaign.
Well, and now the latest purge is before the November 7th election. So now most of the major Sandinista journalists, influencers, communicators, media outlets, and activists have all been erased from the internet. So they're not going to be able to challenge the corporate media narrative, which is just fed by the U.S. government. And they're going to say that the election was supposedly illegitimate, that supposedly it's a dictatorship, that supposedly Nicaraguans don't support the government. All complete lies. And now average Nicaraguans they're not going to be able to challenge that narrative. And of course, this is also a way of discouraging voter turnout, which is the U.S. is telling its puppets in Nicaragua to boycott the election, to not participate, just as the U.S. did the same thing in 2018 in the Venezuelan election. The U.S. forced its puppets like Voluntad Popular, the party of Juan Guaido and Leopoldo Lopez, and other right-wing parties to boycott the election, and they did so. So another point I want to get at is looking at the actual details of this so-called report. Because if you even take a critical eye in any way to this report, which of course no one in the mainstream media reporting on this actually did, they didn't read Facebook's or Meta's so-called report. If you read it, it immediately falls apart with 5 seconds of just critical scrutiny. So here are the main points of this report. They removed 937 Facebook accounts, 363 Instagram accounts, 140 Facebook pages, 24 groups, all of them pro-Sandinista. And that might not seem like a lot, but Nicaragua only has a population of 6.5 million people. It's smaller than basically all U.S. states. This is a very small country. So purging all of the major Sandinista journalists and influencers a few days before the election can actually have a tangible impact on the election results. That's actual election meddling. But anyway, here's the so-called report. This is an 11-page report published by Ben Nimmo, the NATO press officer with no actual expert background. So here, there's a few points I want to raise from this. Here's a graph that Ben Nimmo published, and this graph is incredible. If you took a statistics class in college and you gave this report to your statistics professor, they would fail you. Now look at this graph. They say that the supposed troll operations shift pattern from Monday through Sunday to Managua time. Note the late morning spike in activity, the drop in the middle of the day, and the significantly reduced volume of posting at weekends. There's two things you want to point about this. First of all, this is what all of Twitter looks like, and all of Facebook looks like. When people are awake in the morning, they wake up and get on social media to see the news, and they post. When they're working through the day, they post less. And then at night, when they're hanging out with their friends or family members or watching TV or whatever, they don't post. That's everyone in the entire world. This is how social media works. And second of all,
a skeleton crew on weekends. They have a
second of all, where's the axis? What is the y-axis? There's no y-axis. Look at this graph. All it has is the hours at the bottom, and there's no y-axis. What is this graph? There's nothing there. Like, if your statistics professor would fail you. This is not a real graph. All it has is a bunch of tweets based on, all right, who is tweeting or posting on Facebook at 4 a.m.? Like, very few people are posting at 4 or 5 a.m. Obviously, it's going to be dead at that hour. And then obviously when people wake up in the morning, I mean, I'm probably a social media addict, but unfortunately a lot of people are social media addicts. And what we do, one of the first things we do in the morning is we wake up and we check social media. And if you took this graph, which has no y-axis, so it means nothing. It's not a real graph. But if you took it in any country in the world, you could say this shows a so-called troll operation in Maryland, in Virginia, in California, in Russia, in China, in Venezuela, in Ethiopia, in Israel. Like,
I think there is a cultural component here that Ben Nimmo doesn't quite understand. A lot of these data people and these tech people, they don't understand when people actually lead what we could call a traditional lifestyle, where they wake up in the morning and then go to lunch and like have like regimented social activities or families because they exist in the metaverse. And Ben Nimmo, he is conflating people who lead ordinary, what we would call ordinary lifestyles, or maybe even healthy lifestyles, with robots. When in fact, he's the robot, just because he's always on a computer all day.
Well,
So
and
there's a lack of human touch there.
Good point. And then another thing about this is, look at this. He says, this is what he writes here. He said, the network was densely interwoven with the government's official communications infrastructure. What he's saying is
people
that
go to work at newspapers.
Well, no, he's saying that you saw that so-called trolls, that is average Nicaraguans who support the Sandinista front, would retweet government accounts. They would retweet state media accounts or government officials, which that's what every country does. When Democrat partisans retweet Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Anthony Blinken, that doesn't mean that they're bots. It means that they support the government, they support the Democratic Party, and they're retweeting them. But they're saying there were technical overlaps between the so-called troll operation and official pages representing various branches of government and the FSLN party. So think about it in the US. If you're a Democrat operative, you support the Democratic Party, you're not a troll, but you're like a blue state, like pussy hat wearing whatever, and you love the Democrats and you retweet DNC accounts on the Democratic Party, then according to this logic, according to Facebook's fake expert, you are a troll of the DNC. That's the logic they're saying. If you retweet the Sandinista party, you're a troll of the DNC.
We should mention that the DNC has run actual troll farms, like Sally Albright's troll farm. And that if you look at analysis of the influencers that circulated around this troll farm, they, in January 2017, got a major bump on Twitter where all of a sudden these like Rick Wilson characters, who's with the Lincoln Project, were totally ignored before. And then all of a sudden Trump comes in and they get this massive meteoric spike in the amount of likes and retweets they get. It was like anytime Rick Wilson or Joy Reid farted or coughed, it would get like 7,000 likes. I remember the day John Brennan joined Twitter, he got 88,000 likes for calling the Trump administration a cacostocracy, as if anyone knows or cares what that word means. And somehow John Brennan captivated Twitter with this one tweet. So it's obvious that there are troll farms out there. There are right-wing troll farms. You wrote about CLS strategies, Ben, run by Obama's top Latin American hand, Mark Firestein, which was running troll farms against Venezuela's elected government, against Bolivia's elected government on behalf of the right. And they're just, they're operating on K Street totally free to do whatever they want.
Well, and even the OAS, the U.S. controlled Organization of American States that helped carry out the coup in Bolivia in 2019, even the OAS later admitted that there were tens of thousands of actual trolls, of fake accounts and bots created in the immediate days before, during, and after the coup in Bolivia to spread fake news. And by the way, I want to point out that right now, constantly, I'm being trolled by fake accounts, by bots on Twitter who claim to be in Nicaragua. And all of these accounts, they all have the name, like they have like Sergio and 8 numbers, Juan and 8 numbers, like Bandalico, 8 numbers. Like they're all these fake accounts, and they were all created in November or October. Like there's tons of these actual troll accounts. They're right-wing bots, and they're constantly trolling me and calling me a sapo, which is like an insult they use, and saying that I'm paid by the dictatorship and all this nonsense. There's actual trolls going on, but of course, those are trolls that support the right-wing opposition and the U.S. government position. But really quickly, I don't want to belabor it too much, but I want to get back to this bogus report written by Ben Nimmo, because again, none of these so-called journalists writing about this purge actually read this report to see how many bogus claims are in this report. It's like Swiss cheese. There are so many holes in this. Look at this. All right, here's another one. He points out that there's this blog called Molotov Digital, Digital Molotov. I know the people who run this blog.
I think Scott Walker called it Mazel Tov Digital, but anyway.
It's just a Sandinista blog run by Sandinista activists who support the government. Look at this blog. Do you think that the Nicaraguan government spent lots of resources making a blog spot website? No. I mean, this is like a very poorly run website run by working class Sandinista militants. And they said their proof that it's supposedly part of a troll operation is that the website highlights the links to its social media accounts, and that its social media accounts retweeted the government. I know the people who run this website. This is not the government-run media. I'll show you what a government-run media outlet. There are state media outlets. Now, there's one called 19 Digital. This is an official state media outlet run by the Nicaraguan government, which every government in the world has. The U.S. is VOA, Voice of America. This is what actual state media looks like in Nicaragua. It is much more professional. It is a much bigger operation than Molotov Digital, which is a small blog run by a few Sandinista activists. Like, why would the Sandinista government need to run a blogspot website when it has its own state media, El 19 Digital, right in front of me, that is much better run, a much better operation, much more professional? Like, Ben Nimmo made this. He is a complete fraud. I'm saying this to his face right now. Ben Nimmo is a fraud. Everything about this report is completely bogus. There's nothing real about this. And finally, the last thing I want to say about this ridiculous. Well, before we go to that, Max,
here's male model Ben Nimmo.
Wait, Max, I'm gonna take this. The last thing I want to say about this,
just to give everyone a look at Ben Nimmo. All right.
Well, we'll talk about him in a second. I just want to point out, because people say that's ad hominem. You can say that he's a U.S. government operative, but what about the report? He said, what about the facts? There are no facts in this report. Look at this. Look at this. This is, for me, the most mind-blowing admission in this bogus report. He says that the supposed troll farm spent a grand whopping total of $12,000 in spending for ads on Facebook and Instagram. $12,000, which is like what the U.S. government spends in 5 seconds on social media ads. But look at this important phrase he uses here. Ben Nimmo admits that this includes the entirety of historic advertising activity by both inauthentic and authentic accounts removed as part of this network. He's admitting that he purged real people, authentic accounts. And I know these people, some of them are friends of mine. I know who they are. Like, these are people who go out and like go drink and party on Friday nights, and like they're real people. Like, they support the Sandinista front, but They're the authentic accounts who were purged by Ben Nimmo. Now, in this 11-page report, he never distinguishes how he knows the difference between inauthentic and authentic accounts. He admits that Facebook purged authentic people, but they never acknowledge who those authentic people are, because all this is a massive purge of Sandinistas. That's what it was. They're blatantly admitting it here by authentic accounts.
Well, they're trying
saying
to
that
deny.
you can't be a Sandinista and you can't support the Sandinista government. And if you are a supporter of the Sandinista government, then we're going to purge you, suspend you several days before the election.
The master narrative is that Daniel Ortega has no base of support and that he has to create fake bot armies in order to create the appearance of support. And then the AP stated that anyone who speaks out against Ortega is immediately jailed, which is totally false and misrepresents what's going on in Nicaragua, where opposition figures have been detained for their role in 2018, where hundreds of people were killed and they were on the payroll of U.S. intelligence, just straight up, were involved in violent activities or in collaborating with the U.S. to impose sanctions on Nicaragua. But the point of this report and the way that it's been covered is to create the impression that Ortega is not the appointed representative or elected representative, not only of a country, but of a 2 million strong workers movement, one of the largest in the Western Hemisphere. That's the Sandinista Front. That he's someone who just pets a cat while he's like fielding phone calls with Bashar al-Assad and the ghost of Gaddafi, alone in his evil dictator cave, and then shooting peaceful protesters through like some paid mercenaries. And, you know,
and the irony is that way more people are killed on a weekly basis, or let me say this, way more people are killed every year in Honduras, the neighbor of Nicaragua, than were killed at the peak of the coup attempt. Throughout all of the coup attempt, unfortunately, there were about 300 people killed, and over half of them were Sandinistas, by the way. But around 300 people were killed in the coup attempt, and Nicaragua was a very peaceful country. Meanwhile, neighboring Honduras, which is basically a neo-colony of the U.S., had one of the highest murder rates in the entire world, and there are way more people killed in Honduras every year than during the coup attempt in Nicaragua.
Nicaragua is one of the least, has some of the lowest rates of violent crime and murders, especially by firearms, in the Western Hemisphere, but certainly in Latin America. I mean, it's a completely different atmosphere than the Northern Triangle Central American countries, as Ben said. You can walk around anywhere, and, you know, if someone's going to come at you, you know, you could probably, if you can defend yourself with your fists, you'll probably be good. Because there just aren't guns everywhere like you see in El Salvador or Honduras. The other thing that you'll see in Nicaragua is just people flying Sandinista flags in front of their homes, on their cars, everywhere. There's just enormous support for the Sandinistas, and you'll just get that in your daily life. And so what they're calling a troll farm is actually a real farm, because many of them are farmers. And what the U.S. wants to do is take down the real farms. Seriously, Nicaragua has like 70%, 80% food sovereign.
No,
It's
over 90%.
over 90. I mean, this is you could call it like a self-defense mechanism or a weapon against sanctions, that it's almost, in some ways, it's sanctions proof. Because of that economy, they at least can't be starved. Venezuela produces a lot less of its own food and has had a tougher time under sanctions. So eliminating
and by the way, yesterday, November 3rd, the U.S. House just voted overwhelmingly to impose new sanctions on Nicaragua through the so-called Renacer Act. The vote was 387 for more sanctions on Nicaragua and 35 against. To be a little fair, I'm usually very critical of the squad. To give a little credit to the squad, they did vote against the sanctions on Nicaragua, and the majority of the Democratic Party did vote for the sanctions on Nicaragua. And again, this is 4 days before the election that they passed these new sanctions. Talk about election meddling. But anyway, keep going.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and the sanctions aim to destroy Nicaragua's sovereignty by targeting its economy. And then, you know, Bill Gates will come in and buy up all the farms. I mean, it has a very sovereign economy. The Sandinista government has provided microloans to farmers to get their own business started. Most of these microloans went to women. So Nicaragua has one of the highest rates of female participation at every level in the Western Hemisphere. Nicaragua took special measures to protect its informal workers, people working in the informal economy during the pandemic, whereas, you saw countries that don't have sovereignty like Honduras or Guatemala putting everyone under really crushing lockdowns following, WHO guidance. And people are rewarding them for that. People reward them for building roads. People are rewarding them for building new health clinics. You see health clinics going up everywhere in the cities and the countryside. I mean, you'll have people tell, and I was there in Nicaragua during the neoliberal period before Ortega was voted in 2006. And it really was shocking to see the amount of deprivation outside the capital of Managua, and to see the transformation. So
one second, I want to point out here really quickly that, speaking of hospitals, this is a huge detail that people don't think about a lot in rich industrialized countries in the global north, that Central America is one of the poorest regions of the entire world, and that Central America has a huge problem with the lack of access to hospitals. And ever since the Sandinistas came back in 2007, they have been skyrocketing the creation of new hospitals and health clinics. Here's a map right here. It shows the 228 hospitals built in the past 8 years in Central America, and 77 were in Nicaragua. And look at neighboring Honduras, 31, El Salvador, 29, Guatemala, 44, Panama, 18. Panama is actually quite, in the context of Central America, Panama is the richest country in Central America. And they built 18, whereas Nicaragua built 77. So, I'm sorry, this is the total number of hospitals. Nicaragua has built 20 public hospitals. This is the total number of hospitals. Pardon me for that correction there. They built 14. So Nicaragua has over nearly 4 times as many hospitals as Panama, twice as many hospitals as Honduras. And in Nicaragua, all medical attention is free. I know a friend of mine, his mom had cancer, and she got chemotherapy, 30 sessions of chemotherapy, and didn't pay a single cent. Whereas in the US, the great beacon of freedom and democracy, the most common form of bankruptcy in the US is medical expenses. And the most common reason for bankruptcy due to medical expenses is due to cancer treatment. So we're talking about the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti, providing free, high-quality healthcare at all levels, building dozens of new hospitals, having more hospitals than any other country in Central America. And then people say, I don't get why they support the so-called dictator. He's not a dictator. He's elected. Yes, this is going to be, this is Ortega's 4th term. That's true. But in some ways, term limits can be anti-democratic if people support their president and want to have their president back. And as we see in the US, there are a lot of liberals who worship Obama and who said they wish they could vote Obama for a 3rd term. And in some ways, like, as much as I hate Obama,
they had to have a 3rd term through a guy who can barely even knows where he is. I mean,
exactly.
Obama's still pulling the strings.
We're supposed to believe that Nicaraguans either, one, the propaganda, it's contradictory. There's 2 talking points. One, that Nicaraguans are all forced into submission. They're beaten down by a supposed police state. And by the way, there's way fewer police in the streets in Nicaragua than in the US. Every time I return to the US, especially New York, I'm reminded of how much of a police state it is and how many cops there are in every corner. But anyway, we're supposed to believe that simultaneously Nicaraguans are beaten down by a supposed police state, and that's why Ortega is still in power. Or the other propaganda point is that Nicaraguans are all too stupid and too ignorant that they're supposedly bribed to vote for the Sandinistas. And we're supposed to believe that there's no genuine support. But the reality is that there's a lot of genuine support. Polls consistently show around 2/3 of Sandinistas, 2/3 of Nicaraguans, not 100%, not 90%, around 65% of Nicaraguans support the Sandinista front and support Ortega because he brought free education, free healthcare, job programs, public housing, all these programs, which you're never allowed to talk about. And if you're a Nicaraguan and you go on social media and you tweet about it and you share government media, well, then you're going to be purged for supposedly being a troll.
Yeah, if you support any of those things, you're on a troll farm, and then you can be disappeared. So I think that's one aspect of Facebook that was also detailed in a sort of stunning way by the fake whistleblower Frances Haugen, who Alex Rubinstein profiled for us at the Gray Zone when she talked about their threat intelligence division and counter espionage group. I had no idea such a thing existed within Facebook. It turns out Ben Nimmo is a big part of that. And Facebook has hired ex-spies. I mean, who they're not really ex-spies. They're just not technically affiliated with the CIA or military intelligence or wherever they work. But Facebook is essentially an arm of U.S. information warfare, as we can see, as well as the surveillance state. And Frances Haugen's testimony was focused entirely on designated enemy states, including now Ethiopia, which is facing a huge offensive by a force that the U.S. appears to support. So it was clear where her testimony was going. And I think I see this purge in light of her testimony. And I also see the rebranding of Facebook as part of a wider and really disturbing trend where, if you understand how Facebook was born as a surveillance tool, how it's used by the police to arrest, for example, young Black men in cities based on Facebook posts where they state their intention to, have a conflict with another individual. Tons of arrests take place because of Facebook raids. We wrote about Jeremy Lofredo and I wrote at the Gray Zone about a military intelligence think tank in Northern Virginia called MITRE, spelled MITRE, which developed for the FBI a technology that can actually capture your fingerprints off of social media. So if I just go like that, my fingerprints are captured. This is a real thing. So to understand and recognize the surveillance capacity of Facebook and other social media networks, and then to consider that we're moving from the Internet of Things into the Internet of Bodies should really disturb everyone. And this is an aspect of the Facebook rebranding that needs to be more thoroughly assessed. Meta is not really the rebranding of Facebook because Facebook has been getting so much bad press. Meta is something that Facebook had in the works for a while because of the advent of the Internet of Bodies, where we will actually experience the internet as reality. Virtual reality will be the future of the internet. And so this isn't a rebranding. It's just a new stage of the internet experience where our entire lives can be jammed into a virtual experience. That includes our sex lives, especially if you are into like weird stuff. You probably have trouble finding sex partners. Well, you can find it in the metaverse. That could include our schooling. In-person learning suffered a huge blow last year with lockdowns. And so that and all these social distancing measures normalized the kind of stay-at-home experience. Schooling is being pushed into the metaverse. At office working, you can go to the office or go to a board meeting in this virtual world, and everything you do, including your activist meeting, can and will be surveilled. There will be no private space, which means our social movements are pretty much in peril. Let me throw up a video of Zuckerberg's first introduction of the metaverse. It's pretty insane. Here we go.
Hey, are you coming?
Yeah, just gotta find something to wear.
See, he's at home. He's got a really nice home, but most people don't have homes like that, so they might want to escape.
Oh, hey, Mark.
Wait, can you pause it for a second? This might be really dumb. Can you just go back for a second? This might be a dumb point. I just want to make fun of Zuckerberg because he's like a human cartoon character. And right there, pause it. Someone pointed out, I forgot who pointed this out, but people remember when he was testifying, when Zuck was testifying in the U.S. Congress, and people were like, why does his haircut look like he's a 4-year-old who tried to cut his hair with scissors, and it looks so weird.
Like he
And
used a Flowbee.
And then you look at the cartoon character version of him, and it's like, oh, I think Zuck looks in a mirror and he sees a cartoon character. Like he has already been living in his own metaverse, and he wants to look like his own cartoon character. It's like this weird psychoanalytical Freudian thing, or I don't even know. It's really
very meta.
And he's like, he just assumes that everyone wants to be like an online cartoon character living in the metaverse just like he does.
Yeah, right. Because he's clearly deeply uncomfortable being in public. He's extremely neurotic. He's kind of shut in. So this is the perfect place for him. And then he thinks everyone else must want it. So yeah, he's in his Hawaiian
All right, perfect.
house, McMansion. And now he's at the board meeting,
Mark,
and
hey,
everyone's
what's going on?
friendly
Hi,
and
Mark.
happy.
Whoa, we're floating in space.
We're floating. We
Wait,
don't
this
even have
place,
to
That's awesome.
experience gravity
It's from a
anymore.
crater. I met in LA.
This place is amazing.
Boz, is that you?
Of course it's me.
This-
You know I had to be the robot, man.
I thought
This
I was
place
supposed
is
to
so
be the
much
robot.
better than my ex-urban hovel that I'm about to get evicted from.
I knew you were bluffing.
Hey, wait. Where is Naomi?
Wow,
Let's
I have
call
a
her.
robot friend.
Hey, should we deal you in?
Hey, sorry I'm running late, but you've got to see what we're checking out. There's an artist going around Soho hiding AR pieces for people to find.
Oh my god.
3D street art. That's cool.
Send that link over so we can all look at it.
Wow, street art. Cool.
Wow, street art inside
That's
here.
awesome.
Wow,
It's
I
like
love the movie.
Pokemon
Wait,
Go,
it's
but
disappeared.
uglier.
This is amazing.
Hold on, I'll tip the artist and they'll extend it.
Wow. Brilliant.
I'll
So
tip
you
the
can-
artist. So she's talking about the exchange of digital currency there, tipping the artist. Central bank digital currency is, another aspect of this where your currency is linked to your identity and controlled by central banks. So essentially, without any cash, you could easily be cut off or kind of sanctioned for any reason.
Well, and
Here, I have
Facebook,
another-
pause for a second. People forget that Facebook already launched its own digital currency. I
Right.
think it's called the DM. And now this is, no one cared about it. I don't think anyone really invested in it. But now this is going to be their way to try to get people to actually buy their stupid digital currency is by doing all this stuff. So it's like, I guess all currency is kind of fake, but most currencies are backed by states. But Facebook, this corporation, which is trying to make its own like state within technology to control people, is going to issue its own currency. It really is like techno-feudalism, where they do it. Facebook's going to do all of the things that a state does, but it's controlled by a billionaire.
Right. And cash will be outmoded. So those who rely on cash, people who are called unbanked, become surplus humanity. That includes the homeless population of US, the poor, older people, people who work in the informal economy around the world, which is actually the majority or close to the majority in the global South, and people who engage in activity that's considered illegal, which could even be activism. So it's further securitization of every aspect of our life.
Another room that you're going to love. Check out this forest room.
Check out you're gonna love
let's
this. This guy's
Koi
really
fish that fly?
this robot
That's new.
lobster.
This is
I don't
wild.
want to be friends with him.
Hey, one sec, Boz. It's Priscilla.
Hey, you have to see this. Beast is going crazy.
Oh, I love
Beast.
that guy.
I love that guy. Wait, we got to hear him say that again. He doesn't love anything. He doesn't know. He doesn't have any experience of.
This is where they're trying to humanize him.
Hey,
Yeah.
you
Oh, he
have
has a
to see this.
dog.
Beast is going
That's his wife, I
crazy.
think.
Yeah,
Oh,
he has
I
a
love that
dog.
guy.
Oh my god!
I
he's a
love that
human
guy.
You
too.
gotta show that to the kids.
He look at
He
how
also sent that
bland
to
his
my dad.
lawn is in his
I'll
yard.
message him.
All right, see you at home. This place is great, Boz, but there's something I got to get back to. All right, so that's a glimpse of a few ways that we're going to be able to get together and socialize in the metaverse.
Okay.
Honestly, Mark Zuckerberg might be the first human being where the cartoon version of him looks more like him than the real version of him. Because you look at him, and he looks like just like a white wall. He looks like cardboard. He's made himself try to look like a cartoon character as much as possible.
Yeah, I tried to make an avatar on my iPhone of myself, and it just wasn't that realistic. Maybe because I just look strange or my face is too incongruous. But Zuckerberg really I mean, he's almost like the avatar stepped into reality. But deeply disturbing. I wanted to play.
I do want you to, I do want you to be able. I think you should keep going and riffing on this because there's so much good stuff to say. Unfortunately, I do have to run for an interview on Nicaragua.
No, I got to run too. I just wanted to throw that up there, but I have another
want to
video of Zuckerberg being neurotic. But go ahead.
Well,
Ben.
you should keep going, but I want to make a final point before I have to run here about Facebook and its Meta's merger with the U.S. government. So this is the report I did on the Nicaraguans purged for daring to be Sandinistas. But there's a part here of the article that you were getting at earlier about Ben Nimmo, and it shows how much the U.S. government has not just really penetrated, but really merged with Meta, with Facebook. And we talked about how Ben Nimmo, who's the leader of Meta's so-called threat intelligence team, is a former press officer for NATO. He also worked with an actual troll farm, the British government and NATO-backed Integrity Initiative. And as you mentioned, he was head of investigations for Graphica, which is backed by the Pentagon's Minerva Institute and DARPA, which, as our friend Yasha Levine has shown in his journalism, was actually what created the internet and a lot of big tech technology. But to the extent that people know who Ben Nimmo is, they probably know that Ben Nimmo is basically a U.S. deep state operative, an intelligence-linked, Pentagon-backed operative. But I wanted to point out that he's not the only one, that Facebook's entire so-called security and intelligence team was basically farmed out by the U.S. government. So this was made patently obvious by the people who shared this totally bogus report on supposed Nicaraguan trolls. This guy right here, Nathaniel Gleitscher or whatever, he shared this report falsely claiming that the Nicaraguan Sandinistas purged were government trolls. Now, who is this guy? Nathaniel Gleitscher. He is the head of security policy at Facebook. But what did he do before Facebook? He was at the White House National Security Council, where he was director for cybersecurity. And then before that, he did tech stuff at the DOJ. So this is a guy who, where did Facebook find this guy? They found him because he was the cybersecurity policy head for the White House National Security Council. He's not the only one. His colleague, who is Facebook's so-called director of threat disruption, David Agranovich, he also
what kind of a title is that?
Yeah, exactly. Director of threat disruption. He was also hired because he was part of the White House National Security Council, where he was director of intelligence. So this is a clear example of how Facebook farmed out its security team from these spooks, from these guys who worked for the National Security Council on tech, that is on censorship, and who worked for a bunch of different U.S. government agencies and neoconservative think tanks. Here is the LinkedIn account of the head of security policy at Facebook. He also worked at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is like the king neocon think tank in D.C., funded by Western governments, funded by the arms industry, and run by Kagan, Robert Kagan, like the king, the art neocon. And then before that, he was also at the National Security Council and the DOJ. This is the guy running Facebook's security team. So not only is this dystopian, like neo-techno-feudal metaverse reality that we're facing, not only is it already scary enough, but it's basically just going to be run by the U.S. government. I mean, I think that's the point to make there, is that Facebook's so-called intelligence and security team, or Meta's intelligence and security team, they're all just U.S. government operatives. And I mean, you should keep going here. There's a bit more to say, but unfortunately I have to run.
I got to run too. So thanks everyone for joining us. And thanks to Ben for the report from Nicaragua. We're going to be following up. I think the election is on November 7th, which I think is Sunday. So I might be getting that wrong. We'll be following up the day after with Ben, and we'll see what happens down there. And Stella Moris told you how you can support Julian Assange. So follow us next week. And thanks everybody for all your comments and for all the for all of the wise ass comments, especially. I wish I could have thrown more up on screen because there were some good ones. But yeah, we'll be back next week. Peace.